this class, we'll discuss about object equality and object equivalence. Object equality, it basically checks whether two objects have the same identity. In identity, by identity we mean whether two objects have the same address in memory. Okay. In Java, every variable name for an object is a reference to the object. The reference to the object is nothing but the address of the object in memory. So when you check for object equality, you are checking whether two objects have the same address or not. Okay. So let's look at an example program. So I have a class called table which has these three attributes: length, width and height. So the constructor of this class creates a table initializing the length, width and height. And here I'm creating, in my main program, I'm creating a table with dimensions 3, 2 and 5 for the length, width and height, and that is John's table, let's say. Now let's create another reference called Chris table and assign John table to it. Now both John table and Chris table are pointing to the object created on line number 16 with dimensions 3, 2 and 5. So both objects are pointing to both references, John table and Chris table, are pointing to the same object in memory. So both will have the same address. So when you try to check whether John table is double equals Chris table, you are checking for the object equality, so it will be true. Now let's create one more table called Mary's table with dimensions 4, 7 and 6. And now this table, Mary's table, is pointing to an object which is different from the object that John's table is pointing to. So John's table is not the same as Mary's table. So this line number 22 will print false. So if you run this program,
And are those two Jones and Mary's table?
so John's table is true, is the same as Chris's table, and John's table is not the same as Mary's table. Okay. Now let's go to object equivalence. In Java, two objects A and B are equivalent if A dot equals B is true. So equals is a method, and if you invoke the equals method on A and pass object B to it, if it is true, then those two objects are equivalent. If your class does not implement the equals method, then the equals method from the object class is used. The object class is a parent of all classes in Java. So if you do not provide an equals method in your class, it will inherit the equals method from the object class, which is the mother of or the root of all classes in Java. And in the object class, the default equals method will just check if the double equals is true. That means it is just checking for object equality. So the default object equivalence is nothing but object equality. So equivalence has to satisfy four properties. One is reflexive, symmetric, transitive and consistent. Reflexive means A dot equals A should always be true. Symmetric means if A dot equals B is true, then B dot equals A should also be true. And transitive means if A dot equals B is true and B dot equals C is true, then A dot equals C is also true. And finally, consistent means two equal objects should have the same hash code. But same hash code does not imply object equivalence. So let's look at an example of object equivalence. Here I have a class called person which has a name, year of birth, and he also has an email address. Okay. So I'm creating a person object with the name and the year of birth. Okay. And I'm providing an implementation for the equals method, and since I provide an implementation for the equals method, I have to provide an implementation for the hash code method. So whenever you override equals, you need to override hash code as well, because two equal objects should have the same hash code. And what I do in the equals method is First I compare if the object that is being passed is the same as the current object. If they are the same, then it should return true. So this is basically checking for the reflexive property of equivalence. Then if this object that is being passed is null, then you should return false, because null means an unknown value. So you are comparing the current object with an object which is null, so we cannot compare it, so it should return false. Then you should also check that this object, whether it's an instance of the person class or not. If it is not an instance of the person class, then it should return false. And finally you cast this object to a person class and then call other, and then check if name is not null. You compare the name of the current object with the name of the other object. If they are not equals, then it should return false. Similarly, you also check the current object's year of birth with the other object's year of birth. The other object is nothing but this guy, which has been cast to a person. So if it is not equals, it should return false. If all these cases do not return false, it should finally return true. So now you should check whether all other properties are satisfied, symmetric and transitive as well. Okay. So let's look at an example of this. In this program, I'm creating an object of a person class. His name is Olusola and he was born in the year 1985. Then I create another object called impersonator with the same attributes of Olusola and same year of birth. Now I'm checking for object equality. Is Sola double equals impersonator? No, because they are both pointing to two different objects. The Sola is pointing to the object created by this line, and impersonator is pointing to another object created by this line, though they have the same name and year of birth. But when you use the dot equals on those two objects, it should be true because they both have the same name and year of birth. Then I create one more person whose year of birth is 1984, and that person, another impersonator, is not the same as Sola because he has a different year of birth. So another impersonator has an year of birth of 1984 and Sola guy has an year of birth of 1985. So this dot equals will be false. Now I create another reference type called another Sola and assign Sola to it. Now both another Sola and Sola are pointing to the same object, so the dot equals will be true, and the dot equals on line 28, which checks for object equivalence, will also be true. Whenever equality is true, then they are also equivalent. So equality implies equivalence. Then I create another object called Olusola with year of birth of 1985. Now this Sola and another Sola are not pointing to the same object, though they have the same attributes. So here this line will be false. So if object equality is false, the object equivalent can still be true. Now both another Sola and Sola have the same attributes, so this will print true. So let's run this program, and you will see that the last two lines are false and true. So Sola is not equal to another Sola, but another Sola is equal to Sola, which is true here. So why don't you all try out this program and try to understand object equivalence.